Is it possible to manipulate God and God's timing? Can we tell God, hey, you're late, and go and try to fix things ourselves? What happens when we try to get ahead of God and do His will on our own? Well, today we're going to find out about King David, Saul, and his kingdom, and people who try to manipulate the will of God and the timing of God. Good morning, I'm Pastor Rini, Senior Pastor of Valley Christian Center. Welcome to 747 Morning Inspiration. And today we're in 2 Samuel chapter 3 and 4. And we're going to look at this because, as you remember, God removed Saul as a king from his reigning over Israel because Saul disobeyed and dishonored God and chose to put himself as in God's place. And so now we see the journey of David beginning to receive the kingdom that was meant for Saul and now given to David. Let me begin in how chapter 3 of 2 Samuel starts, because I love how it starts. It truly is it truly does set the stage for the story. It says, there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David, and David grew stronger and stronger, while the house of Saul became weaker and weaker. So the son, Ishbosheth of Saul, was reigning over Israel as its king, but he was losing ground every day. And the people of Israel knew that the inevitable was going to happen, that eventually David would become the king of both Israel and Judah. And David had 6 sons, by the way, by wives and concubines while he was in Hebron. And what's amazing is none of these 6 sons became his successors, nor were they part of the lineage to Jesus. So David himself is picking up wives and concubines, having sons, Amnon, Chileab, Absalom, Adonijah, Shephatiah, and Ithream. And out of those 6 sons, none of them became his successors, and none of them became the one who would lead toward the United Kingdom like Solomon did. Because even David himself was anxious to have successors to his throne. Now, while there was this great war happening between the house of Saul and the house of David, Abner was the right-hand man of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul. He was his warrior. He ran his military troops. And there was a conversation that happened that didn't go so well with Abner and the son of Saul, where he accused Abner of sleeping with one of his deceased father's concubines. And it infuriated Abner. And he says this in verse 8. Then Abner was very angry over the words of Ishbosheth and said, Am I the dog's head of Judah? Am I a dog's head of Judah? That is kind of a way of saying, how dare you disrespect me? In those days, dogs were not pets. Dogs were not considered, friends of man or loyal. Dogs were scavengers. Dogs ate their own vomit. Dogs caused trouble. Dogs bit people. So dogs were considered unclean, and they weren't considered their friends. So when he says, "Am I a dog's head?" What he's saying is, "Are you considering me some unclean, uncouth, disgusting person that I would dare sleep with a concubine of Saul?" And then Abner's pride was hurt. And he kind of gives this little talking to Saul's son, Ishbosheth. And he says in verse 20, when Abner came with 20 men to David at Hebron. So he tells them, I'm gonna serve David, not you. And so he takes 20 men to David at Hebron. And David made a feast for Abner and the men who were with him. And Abner said to David, so let's set that. Let's say what just happened. The son of Saul insulted Abner. Abner said, "Forget you. I'm going to give your kingdom to David. I'm going to do the Lord's will and make sure you lose your kingdom." And so Abner tries to mess with God's timeline, and he tries to force the hand of God by going and saying, I'm going to make a treaty with David. So he starts an insurrection against his king, Ishbosheth. So Abner dishonors his king by beginning an insurrection, by talking to the people of Israel, talking to the house of Benjamin, and he gathers troops together, and he goes to David, and this is what he says to David when he sees David. I will arise and go, and will gather all Israel to my lord the king, that they may make a covenant with you, and that you may reign over all that your heart desires. So David sent Abner away, and he went in peace. So Abner thinks he has the opportunity and the authority to lead an insurrection against his king, which is basically a death penalty, to tell David, Abner, I will hand over to you Israel. Well, that's not his place. He's trying to force the hand of God and make a timeline on his own. Very important. That's what happened. But that was not God's plan. Because after he left in peace, Joab, who was David's military head, comes back from a bunch of raids, find out that Abner was there, is furious that David would dare give audience to Abner, and so Joab decides to get a secret meeting with Abner only to kill him, to assassinate him. So now Joab is trying to do the will of God in his mind. Joab is stepping into God's place, and Joab is deciding to avenge because he's avenging his brother who was killed by Abner. When David finds out that Joab, his own guy, goes against the king and kills Abner, again, another guy trying to move God's timeline, this is how David responds. This is why David is a man after God's own heart. This is why David was made king. This is what he says. Verse 29, may it fall upon the head of Joab and upon all his father's house, and may the house of Jacob never be without one who is discharged, or who is leprous, who holds a spindle, or who falls by the sword, or who lacks bread. By the way, holds a spindle is very, very, very poor people, usually bondservants or slaves, would spend all day with a little spindle trying to weave wool together for fabric. It was the poorest of the poorest of the poorest who had to do that arduous, painful work. It was just so hard to do. And that was a way to say you're going to live in abject poverty, and all those who come after you are going to live in abject poverty. And then he says, so Joab and Abishai, his brother, killed Abner because he had put their brother Ashel to death in the battle of Gibeon. So once again, someone else avenged themselves, and instead of letting God avenge them, David wanted nothing to do with that. So David mourns publicly the loss of Abner, his enemy's military leader. So Abner loses his life because he stands in the way of God. He tries to manipulate God, and God says, no, that wasn't my time. That was Abner time. And then Joab tries to step in and avenge. He does Joab time, not God time, and he too has this curse placed upon him by David. In verse 37, by the way, David, because he mourned the loss of Abner, he says, so all the people and all Israel understood that day that it had not been the king's will to put to death Abner, the son of Ner. And the king said to his servants, do you not know that a prince and a great man has fallen this day in Israel? And as I was gentle today, though anointed king, these men, the sons of Zeruiah, are more severe than I. The Lord repay the evildoer according to his wickedness. So David says, I am sorry that they did that. I had nothing to do with it. I will not put my hand against Saul's son. I will allow God to deliver me the kingdom. And I ask forgiveness because my man killed your man. David refused to stand in the way of God's timing. He knew better than to try to manipulate God. And says chapter 4, it says, when Ishbosheth, Saul's son, heard that Abner had died at Hebron, his courage failed, and all Israel was dismayed. Now Saul's son had 2 men who were captains of raiding bands. Now that Abner's dead, Ishbosheth, his captains, planned his assassination. And his captains assassinated Ishbosheth and brought the head to King David, saying, here it is, here's the head of our king, expecting to be rewarded. So now the captains of the son of Saul plan an insurrection, and they decide to manipulate God by bringing the head of Saul's son to David, assuming they'll get rewarded, still not understanding that it is David's all his faith is that God would be his deliverer. And he tells them a story how that was inappropriate, and he says about how Ziklag is. Let me read it to you. Verse 9 in chapter 4. It says, when they came to David, these captains with the head of Saul's son. But David answered Rechab and Baanah, his brother, the sons of Rimmon, the Beerothite, as the Lord lives, who has redeemed my life out of every adversity, when one told me, behold, Saul is dead, and thought he was bringing good news, I seized him and killed him at Ziklag, which was the reward I gave him for his news. How much more when wicked men have killed a righteous man in his own bed, because I killed Saul's son in his bed, shall I not require his blood at your hand and destroy you from the earth? And David commanded his young men, and they killed them and cut off their hands and feet and hanged them beside the pool at Hebron. But they took the head of Ishbosheth and buried it in the tomb of Abner at Hebron. Next, once again, look at what David does. David refuses the timeline of man. He refuses to try to use his strength and his authority and his popularity to manipulate the timing of God. David was going to allow the kingdom to be given to him by the hand of God, not by insurrection, not by vengeance, not by lying or cheating, not by power and persuasion, but allow the living God to give him all that he had for him. And so, what do we do with this? How many times have we used our finances or our friends or our influence to try to convince God to speed up his timeline and to manipulate him to get what we want? It is God who cares for us. It is God who gives us the breath of life. It is God who gives us our finances. It is God who gives us a shelter over our head. It is God who keeps us healthy or heals us when we're sick. It is God who has prepared our past, present, and future. It is God who gives us the guidance and direction to the Holy Spirit to walk with him all the way into eternity. It is God. What we learn from today's lesson is you cannot manipulate God. You submit to his will and patiently and with steadfastness just watch the hand of God do what he does and only do what God asks of you. No more, no less. That is the faithful life of an ambassador of Christ. Well, if you like today's video, what are you going to do? Hit that like button. Hit that like button. Hit that like button. And then tomorrow morning we have a special guest speaker at 7:47. Otherwise, God bless you. Love you all. See you Sunday at 10 a.m. Bye-bye.